Then he says, blessed are the merciful. That's where we pick up today. For they will be shown mercy. Now, another value of Jesus' kingdom, right? So, oftentimes, and everybody I think is a little bit different on this, but most of us have something at some point where we would go, that person does not deserve mercy, right? That person does not deserve mercy. So what is mercy? Mercy, by definition, is the idea that a person does not get what they deserve, right? So think of it this way. If you are driving home today and you decide to go like 120 through downtown and you get pulled over and they say, okay, here's your ticket, or now you're going to jail, or whatever, and you go before the judge and you say, will you have mercy on me? And the judge goes, oh, that's interesting, because you were doing like $1.20 in a 25. And you're like, but please don't give me what I deserve, right? I don't want 6 months in jail and a $1,000 ticket. Can we maybe bump it down to like 30, whatever. If the judge says, well, here's what we'll do. We'll defer this, and we're going to do this, and you have this fine, but we're going to defer it. If you get another ticket, well, then you're going to the pokey for 6 months, right? That would be mercy, because you did not get what you deserved, right? You endangered the public, but you don't get what you deserve for it. So there's many of, I think most of us, if we went around the room, would be like, yes, I think mercy is appropriate. But somehow, oftentimes, we lose sight of mercy for others. And let me just say this. When the Bible's talking about mercy, it's not talking about at the expense of justice. All right? So don't think when we're talking about biblical mercy, the idea is, hey, I just went out and shot someone, and someone goes, oh, don't sweat it. It's not a big deal. There's biblical justice that's important. And so please don't think like, oh, he's saying that everyone should just have mercy and we should scrap the criminal justice system. I'm not saying that at all. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, about how judgment works and these type of things. What I am saying is what the scripture says here is it is a blessed heart posture. It's a blessed or a happy position to be when you're affording others mercy, where you're not always handing out what people deserve. And just as we want that, right? We want that. How many of us would make a claim to not need the mercy of God? At any point of our lives. How many of us would say like, well, there was this one week where I just did super good, and I really didn't need God's mercy. Or there was this one day. It was an incredible day. I woke up that day, I had a halo, and then I just levitated everywhere I went. I did not need the mercy of God. No, that day doesn't exist, right? That moment doesn't exist. And so in Jesus' economy, in his kingdom values, he makes a point here, and we're going to kind of go through this. It's important. He says, if you are merciful, there is a blessing that is associated with that because you will be shown mercy. That's incredible. And I really want to break that down because there's been a lot of times where, I don't know about you, but I've heard kind of like Bible teachings that go somewhere along like this. They kind of take the opposite approach, and they say, hey, you better be merciful or God's not going to have mercy on you. Has that ever been practically true in any life? I don't think so. I don't think any of us could say, well, yeah, there was this time that I was unmerciful, and then God just took his mercy away from me. That's not true, right? And we have so many verses that we can talk about that in John 5:24, that those that hear my voice and believe in me, they shall never see judgment. And it's a progressive thing. We'll never, ever be judged, is the idea there in Greek. There's the idea that his mercies endure forever. His mercies are new every morning, right? So you have all these verses that clearly point out the fact that God is merciful all day long to the sinner, right? So now when we get to something like this, we don't throw all of that out and go, well, I guess unless you're not merciful, and that's kind of the hitch. And if you're not merciful, then boop, it's over. No, that's not the case at all. David was unmerciful, right? David had Uriah slain because David slept with Uriah's wife and he had to cover up pregnancy. God was very merciful, right? What did Nathan come to him and say? God is having mercy on you. Your sin is forgiven, right? You're forgiven of your sin. That was a capital crime. David should have been executed. All of Jerusalem should have shown up, and he gets kicked off of a little embankment about 20 feet, and then they would all just hail stones down upon him. But instead, God says, hey, your sin is forgiven you. So there's this mercy that occurs. So how does it work in our lives? How is it that we receive mercy, more mercy as it were, or however you want to quantify that, by being merciful? And I want to camp on that, but first, to kind of add to it, I want to read out of the same speech or the same talk that Jesus is giving in Matthew 7. Because we're going to kind of correlate this a bit, because this is an unfortunate thing I think that gets lumped in here. So in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus speaking to the same people in the same place at the same time, he says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Again, it's kind of a confusing verse, isn't it? Because we're told that, okay, if the person who's believed in Jesus is not passing a judgment, we're told in 1 Thessalonians 5 that he has not destined us, the believer, for wrath. Our destiny is never wrath. We've been delivered from wrath, right? Perfect tense in Greek. So over and over again, you have this complete and utter deliverance and forgiveness and promise of mercy. But yet we read these things where Jesus is now sitting down in the first century talking to these Jews, and he's saying, look, these are the values of my kingdom. This is how it works. So if we're not careful, we kind of take these, and I call them like shrug verses, because you read it and you're like, well, I know I'm saved by grace and it's not of works, and I know that it's a gift, but I don't know. I guess I better not judge someone and be merciful, or I lose it all, right? And it just becomes these ambiguous Bible teachings where you're like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm secure, but there's this weird verse, so maybe I'm not secure. And it creates kind of a fear and an anxiety and an unsurety about where we stand with Christ. And so it's important to talk about these things. So if he says, I receive more mercy when I'm merciful, and if he says, I have to be careful not to judge people or I will be judged with the same standard, how does that practically work out in my life? Well, I want to say this. Number one, this word for judgment, which I cannot pronounce in Greek, it's in the New Testament 115 times, okay? It gets translated judgment. It gets translated condemnation. It gets translated like evaluated. It gets translated in like 4 or 5 different ways. But over those 115 times, it gets translated condemnation 9 times. And what you'll find is if you go back and you look at those places where it's translated condemnation, because condemnation and judgment are 2 different things. And we'll talk more about it. But when it's translated condemnation, it's almost always in kind of an active, passive, or in a past tense type of thing. In other words, shall have been judged or shall be judged. So what condemnation is when you make a judgment about something or someone, and it's kind of an irreversible final judgment. So if you were to look at a person's life and you were to say, that person could never be saved, that person, they only deserve to go to hell, that would be condemnation. If you look at a person and you say, oh, you do what sin? There's no hope for you. That would be condemnation, right? And even Jesus in John 8 and John 3, twice he says, and it's right there in the words in red, he says, 1, John 8, I don't judge anyone. I don't condemn anyone. And in John 3, I did not come to condemn the world. So part of Jesus' ministry is, I did not come to condemn the world. Now, in John 3, he says, there is condemnation on every person and every sinner who rejects me. He says, but it comes through the law. So the law has a job, and the law is to condemn and to convict humanity, and the Spirit is there to show us that. When Jesus came in his ministry, it was not to condemn humanity. He says, I came to save humanity, save the world, cosmos, the created order, right? That's the Greek word is cosmos, save the world. So Jesus says, my ministry is to bring salvation to the world, not to bring condemnation. So judgment, and this is where it's judge not lest you be judged is like the flagship of every person that doesn't really want to walk with Jesus. And it's used improperly. Because judge not lest you be judged does not mean that the Christian has no right to look at something and to make an evaluation based on God's heart and law. Does that make sense? So we all have the right and the encouragement, in fact, because he's going to go on from here and he's going to say, judge using righteous judgment. So we have to weigh all these things out, right? So if we have judge not lest you be judged, and a chapter later we have use righteous judgment, well, clearly there's some context here, some topics, right? So the believer in a church setting, in a law setting, in a national setting, has the right to look at something and to say, that's wrong, right? Because typically when this verse in Matthew 7 gets whipped out, judge not lest you be judged, the implication is you could never say anything about my life. No one has the right to say anything about my life because you're judging me. And that's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that at all. In fact, what he says is the kind of that second part, the emphasis is the second part. He says, don't judge lest you're judged. And he says, you will be judged according to the same standard that you judge with. And because of the Greek passive, the way that the verbs are in the Greek, it's clearly talking about God and not humans. So he's not saying, y'all don't judge or other people will judge you. People are going to judge you whether you judge or not. I mean, that's a little bit irrelevant. What he's saying is, and this is another sobering thought, so how do we kind of work through it in the scriptures? What he's saying is, if you have a certain measurement for people and you're constantly applying that to them and you're finding them lacking, not from a good place, not from care and from love, not from desiring for the betterment of someone, but from a place of offense or anger, a sense of self-superiority, he says, if you do that, you have to understand that God will do that to you. Now, that's super scary. But if this isn't a salvation issue, if he's not saying, hey, you know what, here's the thing. Everything that under heaven can be forgiven except if you judge someone. Like, we're all going to hell, right? None of us, I don't think, in a moment of honesty, are going to stand up and go, I judge no one. Right? I don't even see what people do. My eyes are so focused on Jesus. There's sin out there I didn't even know. You know, none of us are going to do that, right? We're professionals at judging. It comes naturally to us, right? Because, you know, when we see anything, when we come to church, when we go to the store, when we're driving down the street, everything we do, we're interpreting through our own brain. How we were raised, what we were taught, you know, all sorts of things. And hopefully the scripture is cleansing that and working through that and so forth. But we all measure that way, right? And typically when we have a standard that we judge someone with, it's a standard that we ourselves have kept. We rarely are judgmental of people that when we haven't kept that standard, right? And it's a lot of times why some people are more compassionate with other people because they've gone through it themselves and so forth.